Hey, I'm Cristina Quinn. Welcome back to Try This from the Washington Post. This is the second of 3 classes in our course about how the Electoral College works, upping our game as engaged citizens in this election year. In our first class, we covered the basics about the Electoral College, what it is and how it works. In this second class, we're going to do a little time travel to better understand why we have the Electoral College in the first place. All right, class is in session. Let's try this. One of the biggest takeaways I now have is that Americans have been raising their eyebrows about the Electoral College from the very beginning, as in the very beginning of this nation.
In some ways, the Electoral College was kind of an acceptable second or third choice to people. Nobody really thought it was a great idea.
This is Alex Keyssar. He literally wrote the book on the Electoral College. Actually, he's written a bunch of history books, including The Right to Vote, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Point is, he's the guy on this. And as Alex puts it, the Founding Fathers really struggled figuring out how we would choose the leader of our young nation.
Their previous experience, of course, had been with royal executives who were appointed. And they had some experience with the states that had been formed or that had been liberated in 1776, where most commonly the legislature chose the governor, for example, but they really didn't know how to do it.
And there was no blueprint for this.
There was no blueprint, no models out there that they could readily adopt.
So in 1787, the Founding Fathers tackled all of this in a meeting, better known as the Constitutional Convention. Yeah, you know the one. It was in Philadelphia. Some pretty big names were there. George Washington, James Madison, Ben Franklin, just to name a few. In all, 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 states attended. And over the span of close to 4 months, they got a lot done, including drafting the U.S. Constitution. They worked out congressional power, regulating commerce, taxation, but they could not agree on how to elect our new country's leader.
In the early meetings of the Constitutional Convention, the default position, in a way, was that Congress would choose the executive.
Mm-hmm.
And several times in the course of the Constitutional Convention, they took kind of straw votes. And that was the idea that had more support than any other. But each time after they would take those straw votes and they would talk about it, they'd say, no, that's really not a good idea, because if Congress chooses the executive, then the executive will be dependent on Congress. And if the executive wants to be reelected, he will be currying favor with Congress, and there won't really be the separation of powers.
They tossed around other ideas, too, from having governors elect the president to holding a national popular vote. The debate went on and on and on. Bear in mind that the convention started in May.
And they got to the end of the summer, and most of the Constitution was drafted, and everybody was tired. It was late August in Philadelphia. It was hot.
That's a long convention.
That's a long convention.
So we get to the point at the end of the summer, they're hot and they're tired.
They're hot and they're tired. And there was opposition to having a national popular vote, not only from the South, also from people who thought that the country was too dispersed, that the electorate as a whole would not have any knowledge of the candidates. Try to think about the technology of the time and the amount of information that was available to people. They had a reasonable lack of confidence that a farmer in South Carolina would be acquainted with a senator from Massachusetts enough to be able to decide. And so they did what any good convention would do. They declared a week of vacation, and they appointed a committee to deal with the, quotes, unfinished parts of the Constitution, one of which was how to choose a president.
Over the span of a few days, the Committee on Unfinished Parts, yes, that's what it was really called, invented what we now call the Electoral College. And they did it by making a number of compromises. The committee essentially said, hey, let's elect the president using electors from each state. But how to determine how many electors each state gets? They decided to use the system they had already devised for the House of Representatives. the number of representatives would be proportionate to the state's population. Well, mostly, except for one big thing.
The population of many southern states, was 30-40% African-American slaves. So that gave them multiple additional seats in Congress and then consequently additional electoral votes.
But enslaved people were considered property, and the southern states didn't want to be taxed for the enslaved population. The northern states didn't want the South to include them either because they weren't free people, and would have skewed representative power away from the North. So the founders agreed to what's known as the 3/5 Compromise.
The ignominious compromise that they reached was to have slaves count as 3/5 of a person towards representation.
This became the way a state's population was totaled. The free population plus 3/5 of an enslaved person. And each state's number of congressional representatives would be proportionate to that total. The structure that they created for the Electoral College replicated these compromises, but there were a lot of other challenges to come. What the founders couldn't quite foresee about the Electoral College after the break. The Electoral College of today looks a lot different than it did back then. After all, political structure as we know it today didn't exist yet.
I mean, for one thing, you should realize that candidates for president and vice president were not nominated separately. There were no tickets because there were no parties.
Mm-hmm.
So in the original conception, the person who won the most electoral votes would become president, and the person who won the second most electoral votes would be vice president.
So you win the thing, and then your second in command is the person you beat. That's messy. But those were the rules after the Constitution went into effect in 1789. And those rules didn't last long, considering what happened in the election of 1796, right around the time political parties were established. That's when Thomas Jefferson ran against the Vice President John Adams. At the time, there were 16 states and only 138 electoral votes. In the end, Adams won 71, a majority, but Thomas Jefferson won 68. That meant the president and VP were from opposing political parties. Like I said, messy. Things got even messier in the 1800 presidential election when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr had an electoral vote tie. And they were in the same party. The House of Representatives had to break the tie, but that too was ugly. It was a whole thing that went on for months. There's even a song about it in the musical Hamilton.
If you had to choose, if you had to choose, it's a tie. If you had to choose,
The lack of designation of president and vice president contributed to a real crisis in 1800, and that really precipitated the 12th Amendment.
The 12th Amendment was designed to deal with the drama. Congress passed it in 1804. The amendment mandated separate nominations for president and vice president. It also laid out a plan for exactly what would happen if two candidates tied in the electoral vote count. What continued to be a hotly disputed issue was how states should award electoral votes. Over the next few decades, states did a lot of experimenting with how they chose their electors. In some states, the state legislatures chose the electors. In other states, it was a popular vote or district-based.
The parameters of the right to vote was left to the states, which was a disastrous mistake in retrospect. It sanctioned the disenfranchisement of all sorts of people, ranging from, Black people to all sorts of other minorities throughout the United States. And the battles which we see today, even today, over voting rights in different states, it's all decentralized. We don't have uniform voting requirements.
There were many efforts to amend the Constitution to prevent the use of winner-take-all and instead require congressional district elections. But those efforts never quite panned out because it would have taken away power from the large states, something they didn't want to give up. By the 1824 presidential election, the majority of states used a statewide winner-take-all voting method for choosing their presidential electors. And that consensus pretty much became the way forward.
By the 1830s, after, roughly 40 years of experimentation, the norm became you would have a popular election, and the other norm became winner take all rather than districts.
And that, my friend, is how we've elected our presidents ever since, with the exception of the 3/5 Compromise, which was removed from the Constitution under the 14th Amendment in 1868. It granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people and gave them equal protection under the law. But it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, nearly 100 years later, that significant barriers came down and all Americans could vote. Today, some Americans still face challenges to exercising that right, and voting rights advocates continue to fight for reforms. Okay, let's recap Alex's key takeaways about the origins of the Electoral College. Our founding fathers met in Philly in the summer of 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. There they drafted the U.S. Constitution, hence the name. And one of their major action items centered around how we elect the president. After being unable to reach an agreement, they left the task to the Committee on Unfinished Parts. They made it so electors from states would choose the president. Presidential elections were messy, with many candidates and ties or deadlocks. So in 1804, Congress passed the 12th Amendment, which mandated separate nominations for president and vice president. It wasn't until the 1830s that the winner-take-all system was widely adopted. And that leads us to present day. Okay, that's it for our second class. Up next, in our third and final class on the Electoral College, we'll explain some of its biggest flaws, alternatives to this voting system, and why it's particularly difficult to change. All right, meet me in class 3.